The ship had been dead for 3 million years when human hands first touched its hull. Dr. Sarah Chun stood at the edge of the excavation pit on Mars, staring at the curved metal surface that poked through the red sand like the spine of some ancient beast. Her heart was beating fast. Her team had found something impossible. They had found proof that humanity was not alone in the universe. The discovery changed everything. Within weeks, governments from every nation sent their best scientists to Mars. The excavation grew larger each day. When they finally uncovered the full shape of the vessel, it stretched nearly 2 kilometers long. Its surface was covered in strange symbols and patterns that no human mind could understand. The metal was unlike anything found on Earth. It did not rust. It did not break. It simply waited, silent and patient, for someone to learn its secrets. Commander James Wright led the first team inside the ship. They walked through corridors that had not seen light in millions of years. The air was stale but breathable. Strange machines lined the walls, their purposes unknown. In the central chamber, they found the bodies. 12 of them, arranged in a circle around a glowing crystal that still pulsed with faint blue light. The aliens were tall and thin, with elongated skulls and 4 arms. Their skin had turned to something like leather over the countless years. They looked peaceful, as if they had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. The crystal was the key to everything. Dr. Chun spent months studying it alongside the greatest minds on Earth. They discovered that it contained information. Not just data, but knowledge. Compressed files that held the complete history of a species called the Valori. They had traveled across galaxies. They had built empires that spanned thousands of star systems. And then, like so many others before them, they had fallen. A great war had destroyed their civilization. This ship and its 12 passengers had been trying to escape. They made it as far as Mars before their engines failed. They died waiting for rescue that never came. The knowledge inside the crystal was worth more than gold. It contained blueprints for technologies that human scientists had only dreamed about. Faster than light travel. Energy systems that could power entire cities for centuries. Medical advances that could cure diseases thought impossible to treat. But the knowledge was incomplete. Large sections were corrupted or missing. It was like finding half of a puzzle without knowing what the final picture should look like. Still, humanity worked with what they had. Engineers spent years trying to understand the Valori engine designs. They failed more times than they succeeded. Ships exploded on launch pads. Scientists died in accidents. But humans did not give up. That was the one thing that set them apart from every other species they would eventually meet. They were stubborn. They were determined. They refused to accept that something was impossible. 20 years after the first discovery, humanity launched its first faster-than-light vessel. The journey that would have taken thousands of years now took only weeks. They called the ship Hope, and it carried a crew of 50 brave souls into the unknown darkness of space. What they found out there would change the course of human history forever. The galaxy was a graveyard. Everywhere humans looked, they found the remains of dead civilizations. Ancient stations floating in the void. Abandoned cities on lifeless worlds. Ships drifting without power or purpose. Some had been dead for millions of years. Others had fallen more recently. Each one held secrets. Each one held treasures waiting to be claimed. The Valari were just the first. Humans found the technology of the Crethians, a species that had mastered genetic engineering before vanishing in a plague of their own creation. They found the weapons of the Thornback Empire, a warrior race that had conquered half the galaxy before turning on themselves in a civil war that left no survivors. They found the communication networks of the Singing Ones, beings of pure energy who had simply faded away when their stars grew cold. Other species still lived in the galaxy. The collective was a hive mind of insectoid creatures that controlled several star systems near the galactic core. The merchant guilds were a loose alliance of traders who cared only for profit. The Eternal Watch were ancient machines left behind by a long-dead race, still following orders that no longer made sense. These species had existed alongside the ruins for thousands of years. They had learned to avoid the dead places. They believed that touching the remains of the fallen was dangerous, cursed, even. Humans did not share this belief. Where others saw ghosts and warnings, humans saw opportunity. They sent salvage teams to every ruin they could find. They stripped technology from dead ships. They studied alien corpses to understand different forms of biology. They combined knowledge from a dozen different species, mixing and matching ideas that had never been meant to work together. And somehow, impossibly, they made it work. The other species watched with growing fear. The collective sent drones to observe human activities. What they saw disturbed them greatly. Humans were advancing too fast. They were combining technologies that should not be combined. They were taking risks that no sane species would consider. The collective remembered a time, long ago, when other young species had risen quickly. Those species had burned just as quickly. They assumed humans would do the same. But humans did not burn. They kept growing. They kept learning. They took the rusted remains of other worlds and turned them into something new. Something that had never existed before. Human ships were faster than Valori vessels. Human weapons were more powerful than Thornback armaments. Human medicine was more advanced than anything the Krethians had created. They had taken the best pieces of every fallen civilization and forged them into something greater. First contact with the collective did not go well. The hive mind demanded that humans stop their salvage operations. They claimed that the ruins were sacred, that disturbing them would bring disaster. Commander Maria Santos, the leader of the human diplomatic mission, politely refused. She explained that humans had learned too much to stop now. The galaxy was full of knowledge waiting to be discovered. Humanity intended to discover it all. The collective attacked 3 weeks later. They believed that a quick strike would destroy the human threat before it grew too large. They were wrong. Human ships, powered by hybrid engines that combined 3 different alien technologies, outmaneuvered the collective drones with ease. Human weapons, designed by scientists who had studied 100 different species, cut through collective armor like it was paper. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, the collective had lost 40% of their fleet. They had not destroyed a single human vessel. Word of the battle spread across the galaxy. Other species began to pay attention to the strange creatures from the distant Sol system. The Merchant Guild sent representatives to negotiate trade agreements. The Eternal Watch, who had not spoken to organic beings in 10,000 years, requested a meeting with human leaders. Even species that had been sleeping for centuries began to wake, drawn by rumors of a new power rising in the galaxy. Dr. Chun, now old and gray, gave a speech to the United Human Council. She talked about the Valori and their crashed ship on Mars. She talked about all the species that had risen and fallen before humanity took its first steps into space. She wondered aloud why so many great civilizations had failed. What had they done wrong? What mistakes had they made? And most importantly, how could humanity avoid the same fate? The answer, she believed, was simple. The fallen species had all been alone. They had built their empires in isolation, never sharing their knowledge with others. When problems arose, they had no one to help them. When enemies attacked, they faced them without allies. They had been strong, but strength alone was not enough. They had been smart, but intelligence alone could not save them. They had lacked something that humans possessed in abundance: the ability to work together, the willingness to learn from others, the stubborn refusal to give up even when everything seemed lost. Humanity continued to grow. They formed alliances with other species who were willing to share their knowledge. They established universities where beings from across the galaxy could study together. They created a council where different races could settle their disputes without violence. They did not try to conquer or control. They simply offered a hand to anyone willing to take it. The collective eventually joined the council. So did the merchant guilds and the Eternal Watch. New species emerged from their hiding places, drawn by the promise of peace and cooperation. The galaxy, which had been silent for so long, began to speak again. And at the center of it all, humans kept working. They kept learning. They kept building. They transformed the rusted remains of dead worlds into the foundation of a living civilization. Centuries passed. The Human Alliance, as it came to be known, spread across the galaxy. They found more ruins and more secrets. They discovered the final fate of the Valerie, who had been destroyed by an enemy from outside the galaxy. They learned about the Krethians and their desperate attempt to save their dying species through genetic manipulation. They uncovered the truth about the Thornback Empire and the civil war that had consumed them. Each discovery added new pieces to the great puzzle of galactic history. And through it all, humans remembered where they had started. They remembered the crashed ship on Mars and the 12 dead aliens who had given them their first glimpse of the stars. They built monuments to the fallen species. They preserved their languages and their art. They made sure that the civilizations that had come before were never forgotten, because humans understood something that many other species had missed. The past was not something to fear. It was something to learn from. The rusted remains of other worlds were not curses or warnings. They were gifts, lessons paid for in blood by those who had walked the path before. Dr. Chun's great-grandchildren grew up in a galaxy at peace. They traveled to worlds that their ancestors could never have imagined. They worked alongside aliens of every shape and description. They looked up at the stars and saw not darkness, but possibility. And when asked about their species and how they had risen so quickly, they always told the same story. They talked about a crashed ship on a red planet. They talked about a crystal full of ancient knowledge. They talked about humans who refused to give up, no matter how many times they failed. And they talked about the rusted remains of other worlds that had powered their ascension to the stars. The past had given them wings. And with those wings, they had learned to fly.